Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we are taking on something truly monumental. We are diving into the exhaustive, detailed chronological history of Persia, tracing a timeline all the way from ancient prehistory right up to the geopolitical realities of modern-day Iran.
It's an immense journey. I mean, you're looking at over 6 millennia of documented history, of cultural influence, and political transformation.
And the sources must be incredibly varied.
Oh, completely fragmented. You have everything from archaeological digs to, the war annals of their enemies, which are obviously biased. Then you have internal court histories, modern reports.
So our mission today is really to stitch that all together.
Exactly. We want to synthesize all this evidence into a coherent narrative. And we're not just going to list kings and dates. We want to look at the patterns, the continuity and the change that persists even as these massive empires rise and violently fall.
Absolutely. We'll be moving chronologically, starting with those really mysterious prehistoric urban centers, charting the incredible cycles of empire, and then finishing up with the complexities of the modern Islamic Republic, its internal dynamics, and its global posture.
The story of Iran is, well, it's perhaps the ultimate testament to the resilience of a civilization.
Okay, so let's jump right into those deep roots, the absolute beginning on the Iranian plateau.
Right.
When we talk about the dawn of civilization here, we're moving far beyond the names that everyone knows, like Babylon or Egypt. We're talking about places like the Jiroft culture.
Jiroft, yes, in southeastern Iran, in the Kerman province.
Yeah.
This place is really shaking up our understanding of how early cities developed in the Middle East.
How so?
Well, the excavations there point to one of the earliest civilizations in the region, one that was flourishing way back in the 4th millennium BC. And the things they found aren't just ancient. They're stunningly unique.
Unique in what way?
They suggest a sophisticated, independent cultural center that was operating at the same time as, or maybe even before, some of the major developments in Mesopotamia.
And I remember the artifacts themselves are breathtaking. What defines this culture visually?
The artistry is a key marker. We're looking at objects decorated with these highly distinctive, really complex engravings of local animals, intertwined mythological figures, detailed architectural motifs.
So this isn't just basic pottery.
Oh, no. These were high-value items. They were made from materials like chlorite, that beautiful soft gray-green stone, but also copper, bronze, terracotta, and even imported lapis lazuli.
Wow.
The trade network alone suggests a highly organized society.
And what about their intellectual legacy? There's some speculation that Jiroft might challenge our entire timeline of written language, right?
That's where it gets really exciting. An inscription discovered at Jiroft has led some Iranian archaeologists to propose it might be the most ancient script ever discovered in the region.
Predating what we already know.
Potentially predating and even influencing the Elamite written language. Now, if that's proven, it radically shifts the narrative of where writing truly originated and how it spread across the Iranian plateau.
Okay, so shifting a bit west, we come to Elam. This is the first major, continuously documented power in what is now southwest Iran.
Elamite power is absolutely foundational. It starts around 4000 BC with the founding of the Proto-Elamite city of Susa in the Karun River watershed.
And their story is one of constant interaction with Mesopotamia.
Constant interaction and constant conflict. Its identity was always fluctuating. Sometimes it was under the heel of Sumerian or Akkadian influence, but just as often, it was asserting its own formidable independent power.
And we can actually see that fluctuation in the ground, in the archaeological layers.
Precisely. The earliest levels at Susa show this unique pottery that has no direct equivalent in Mesopotamia, but then the period right after that shows a clear alignment with the Sumerian Uruk period culture.
And this is when writing appears.
Yes. The Proto-Elamite writing system emerges around 3200 BC, and it's used until about 2700 BC. That period then ends with the establishment of the Awan dynasty.
Who was the first outside figure we can definitively say had a conflict with Elam?
The earliest tangible historical link we have comes from the Sumerian king list. It mentions a king Enmebaragesi of Kish around 2650 BC, who is recorded as having subdued Elam.
But the really detailed history comes later.
Right. The consistent narrative really begins with the rise of the Akkadian Empire, which dominated the region from 2335 to 2154 BC. The Akkadians saw Elam as a major rival on their frontier.
Now, the Iranian plateau was huge and diverse. It wasn't just Iranians. We need to talk about the significant non-Iranian groups, especially in the Zagros Mountains. Let's start with the Kassites.
The Kassites are a bit of an enigma. They're often studied in relation to Babylonian history, but their origins are almost certainly in the Zagros Mountains region. We first see them reported in Babylonia in the 18th century BC, specifically around the city of Sippar.
And they were seen as mercenaries or raiders.
Initially, yes, but they made a significant impact very early on. There's a very specific historical marker, the 9th year name of the Babylonian king Samsu-iluna, who was Hammurabi's son.
What does it say?
That year name celebrates his defeat of the Kassite army. So that tells you that by the mid-18th century BC, they were already a persistent military force to be reckoned with. And ironically, after the Hittites sacked Babylon, it is the Kassites who stepped in and ended up ruling Mesopotamia for almost 4 centuries.
Wow. Then moving far to the north, we find the powerful kingdom of Urartu, which was a real thorn in the side of Assyria.
Urartu, yes, often called the Kingdom of Van. It initially appeared in the 13th century BC, not as a unified state, but as a league of tribes called Uratri.
The Assyrians were constantly trying to contain them.
Constantly. Shalmaneser I, who reigned from 1263 to 1234 BC, mounted a campaign specifically to subdue those disunited Uratri tribes. It seems their unity was a gradual process, really built out of necessity.
What did they call themselves?
Later Urartian kings referred to their kingdom as Bianili. Their strength was severely tested in the 8th century BC. In 714 BC, they were hit by devastating Sumerian raids and, at the same time, the relentless campaigns of the Neo-Assyrian king Sargon II.
And that blow from Sargon II was almost fatal, wasn't it?
It was a deep, deep trauma. Sargon sacked their main temple at Musir and stole their national deity. The source material tells us the blow was so severe that the Urartian king, Rusasiras, actually committed suicide in shame.
But they recovered.
Incredibly resilient. Urartu restored his power under Argishtis II. And crucially, around 705 BC, Argishti made a lasting peace with the new Assyrian king, Sennacherib. This detente ushered in a long period of prosperity and development that continued for decades. And this peace allowed them to thrive right before the final arrival of the Iranian tribes.
And that period of prosperity for Urartu ends pretty abruptly as the Iranian-speaking peoples, specifically the Medes, step onto the center stage. This really marks the transition to true empire builders.
The Medes are definitively the earliest Iranian state.
Right.
But right away, we hit a major historical roadblock. The debate around their structure. We have almost zero internal Median sources, no royal annals, no administrative documents. So the question is, did they form a powerful, centralized empire, or were they just a loose confederation of tribes?
So we're entirely dependent on what their enemies and neighbors said about them. That introduces a lot of bias.
It does. Our primary sources are the Assyrians and Babylonians. And then later, the Greeks, like Herodotus, who are writing centuries after the fact and are, often trying to tell a good story.
So what do the Assyrian records tell us?
They show genuine anxiety. There's immense tension on their eastern borders. They're listing adversaries like the Medes, Manians, Sumerians, Scythians. It sounds like a constant drain on their resources.
More than a drain, it sounds like an existential threat.
It was. The Assyrians feared specific Median leaders, especially a city lord named Kushatardi. Their oracle queries show priests constantly asking the gods if he was plotting against them. This relentless pressure is strong evidence that, even if they were decentralized, the Medes were a significant organizing force that was rapidly eroding Assyrian control.
And this organizing force eventually brought down the whole Neo-Assyrian Empire.
The Medes delivered the death blow. The definitive rise came under a king named Xerxes. He cemented a crucial alliance with the Babylonian king Nabopolassar. Together, they invaded Assyria and they destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC. That caused the swift collapse of the whole empire.
A huge power vacuum.
Which the Medes immediately filled. They went on to conquer and dissolve Urartu, effectively clearing the way for the next great dynasty.
And that, of course, is the Achaemenid Empire, the first Persian Empire. It seems to take over almost seamlessly.
The transition was swift because the Persians and Medes were closely related Iranian peoples. All the Persian tribes were united under Cambyses I, but it was his son, Cyrus the Great, who defeated the Medes and established the Achaemenid Empire. And the scale he achieved was just unprecedented.
How quickly did he expand?
Incredibly fast. Cyrus conquered the wealthy Lydian Empire and, very significantly, took the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BC.
Absorbing the last great Mesopotamian power.
Exactly. And the expansion continued immediately under his son, Cambyses II, who went on to conquer ancient Egypt, collapsing its 26th dynasty. They incorporated all the major regional powers into a truly global empire.
The defining moment for the Western historical narrative, though, is the conflict with Greece, specifically under Xerxes.
That really defines the Achaemenid image for us. Xerxes invaded the Greek mainland, seizing Macedonia. We all remember Thermopylae in 480 BC, where the Spartans and their allies made that famous stand.
And Xerxes followed through on his promise to punish Athens.
He seized and burned Athens. It was a symbolic act that Greek writers would mythologize for centuries as the ultimate act of barbarian aggression.
But the crucial turning point came at sea.
At Salamis, yes. The Greek fleet destroyed Persia's naval capability. That loss, plus the defeat at Plataea the following year, forced the Persians to retreat from the European mainland.
But the empire itself was vast enough to survive this. It lasted for another century, though, right?
It did, though it was marked by a lot of stagnation and internal struggle, but it was far from finished. They had periods of revival, especially under Artaxerxes III.
He managed to reconquer some lost territory.
He did. He reconquered Egypt and successfully suppressed serious rebellions in Phoenicia and Cyprus. For a moment, he restored the empire's borders to their greatest extent since Xerxes.
And yet, that success bred internal danger.
It did. The end of his reign is a classic court intrigue drama. He was assassinated by his confidant, the eunuch Bagawas, who wanted a puppet ruler on the throne. This internal instability created the perfect strategic opening for Alexander of Macedon.
Alexander, barely in his 20s, launches his invasion in 334 BC.
And it wasn't just a military campaign, was it?
No, not at all. He crossed into Asia with about 35,000 troops, but the sources emphasize he also brought engineers, scientists, and historians. This was a clear sign of his intent. He wasn't just conquering, he was absorbing and mapping a new domain.
And the Achaemenid resistance, despite the empire's size, just collapsed stunningly fast.
It was a swift, sequential collapse, a result of Alexander's tactical genius and, frankly, Achaemenid disunity. The first major victory was at the Granicus River, then the Battle of Issus. The final critical land defense was the Battle of the Persian Gate. By July 330 BC, Darius III, the last Achaemenid emperor, was killed by his own satrap. The empire was over.
And the destruction of Persepolis was the definitive symbolic end.
Alexander intentionally destroyed the ceremonial capital. Whether it was a calculated political move, a delayed retribution for the burning of Athens, or just a drunken rage, it was understood throughout the region as the absolute termination of the First Persian Empire. So, with Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BC, the Iranian world is plunged into the Hellenistic period, dominated by his successors.
His death triggered the Wars of the Diadochi, which led to the formal division of his empire. The vast majority of the former Persian lands ultimately fell to Seleucus Iconcator, who established the Seleucid Empire in 312 BC.
This created a really unique kind of volatile cultural period. You had Greek administration and military power meeting this deep, enduring Persian culture.
And what's fascinating is the extent of the cultural blending. We know there was significant intermarriage between Greek settlers and the local elites. The Seleucid rulers themselves began adopting Persian-style clothing and court etiquette. It wasn't a passive occupation, it was a hybridization of elite culture.
But the Seleucid group was always a bit tenuous, wasn't it? Especially as their focus was constantly drawn west towards Rome.
Their decline was almost guaranteed. When Antiochus III tried to project power into Greece, he was decisively thwarted by the Roman Republic. This forced him to relinquish all claims west of the Taurus Mountains, and that created a perfect opportunity for a new local power to rise from the northeast.
The Parthians, the archenemy of Rome.
Correct. They were originally nomadic Parnasithians who started expanding around 2047 BC from northeastern Iran. They gradually seized the Iranian plateau, establishing the Parthian Empire under the Arsacid dynasty. Their power truly consolidated under Mithridates the Great.
How did they finally extinguish the Seleucid presence in the region for good?
Antiochus VII made one last, large-scale attempt to retake Mesopotamia in 130 BC. Initially, he was successful, but he made a fatal strategic error. He overextended his army into Media for the winter.
And exhausted the local resources.
Exactly. His troops, mostly foreign mercenaries, wore out their welcome. The critical moment came in the spring of 129 BC when the local Medes openly revolted, allowing the main Parthian force to sweep in and kill Antiochus at the Battle of Ecbatana. That was the end of any serious Seleucid attempt to control Iran.
The Parthian Empire then defined its existence by its constant conflict with Rome. And this is where we see a really interesting insight into the structure of Iranian governance.
It's fascinating. The Parthian Empire was characterized by a loose feudal structure. The Arsacid king of kings relied heavily on powerful local noble families for his troops and resources.
So that decentralized nature was both their strength against external foes and their weakness against internal rivals.
Exactly. It provided strategic depth against Rome. You can never seize one capital and win the war. But it also guaranteed internal weakness and fragmentation.
And that's what led to their downfall.
Ultimately, yes. In 224 AD, the last Sassanian king was defeated, not by Rome, but by his own powerful vassal, Ardashir I, who went on to found the Sassanian dynasty.
The Sassanian Empire. The final great empire of antiquity, and one that consciously rejected that Parthian feudal weakness.
Right. Ardashir founded the Sassanian dynasty, ending the 400-year Arsacid era. He crowned himself Shahanshah, King of Kings at Ctesiphon, and he recognized that to truly rival Rome and Byzantium, he needed robust centralization.
And that was reflected in his military reforms. Can you detail those?
He fundamentally altered the power dynamic by creating a centralized standing army, one that was separate from the levies controlled by the local nobility.
Yeah.
This curtailed the power of the feudal lords. He also restored the old Achaemenid military organization, but wisely retained and perfected the highly successful Parthian heavy cavalry model. The goal was the protection of Iranshar, the realm of Iran.
And the Sassanians successfully protected Iranshar for over 4 centuries, engaging in this unbelievable conflict with Rome.
They were the undisputed Western Eurasian superpower. Their recurrent struggle with the Roman and later Byzantine empires, if you include the Parthian Wars, spanned about 720 years. It's arguably the longest formal conflict in human history.
Wow.
It just exhausted the resources and manpower of both powers.
But even this superpower faced moments of profound vulnerability, which sort of foreshadowed its final collapse.
Yes. While there were internal religious tensions, Yazdegerd II tried to forcefully reconvert Armenia back to Zoroastrianism, which created massive resistance. The true existential threat actually came from the east, the Hepelite Huns.
What was the result of that conflict?
It was devastating. The Sassanian king Peros suffered a crushing defeat against the Huns in 484 CE. He lost his life and, critically, his entire professional army. This disaster forced the Sassanians to pay tribute and left the realm severely weakened, socially and financially exhausted, just over a century before the arrival of the Arab armies.
So the 7th century marks this profound transformation, perhaps the most profound since the arrival of the original Iranian tribes thousands of years earlier, the Islamic conquest.
It was a rapid, seismic event. The Sassanian Empire was annexed by the Rashidun Caliphate between 632 and 654 AD. The pivotal moments were the decisive battles of Al-Qadisiyah and then Nahavand, which sealed the fate of the Sassanian dynasty.
Beyond the change in who was ruling, how did this immediately restructure Iranian society?
The effects were total. It marked the beginning of the Islamization of Iran. The old Iranian elites were systematically displaced, or they converted and were integrated into the new administration. Arabic immediately became the language of religion, administration, and science, temporarily sidelining Middle Persian.
Can we zoom in on the specifics of that military campaign as the Sassanian dynasty was retreating eastward?
Certainly. After securing Mesopotamia, 2 Muslim columns advanced north and east. One moved up the Tigris. The other, under Hashim Bi'Utba, pursued the retreating Sassanian soldiers.
And there was a final stand.
The Sassanian rearguard, led by the brother of their great general Rostam, tried to make a final stand at Ennekon, but was defeated at Jalula with heavy losses. The destruction was total. The last Sassanian emperor, Yazdegerd, fled towards Ray upon hearing of the defeat.
But the Muslims eventually settled back a bit, allowing some stability.
They did. Interestingly, the Persians who had fled from the capital Ctesiphon were allowed to return once they agreed to pay tribute, which shows that the new rule was sometimes willing to compromise for stability.
Now, despite the dominance of the caliphates, that unique Persian cultural identity didn't just vanish. We start to see regional powers asserting Iranian independence.
This is where cultural continuity wins out. By the 9th century, political independence starts to sprout. The Safavid dynasty, founded by Yaqub ibn Layth, established a brief but important period of independence, championing the use of the Persian language.
And meanwhile, the caliphs in Baghdad were becoming just figureheads.
Absolutely. By the 10th century, the Abbasid caliph's authority was purely ceremonial. Real power shifted to local dynasties. First came the Iranian Buyids, a Shia dynasty that controlled Baghdad itself. Then came the Seljuk Turks, who took over Baghdad in 1055.
And the influx of these Turkic groups fundamentally shaped the landscape, but again, they adopted the Persian model.
This is the critical cycle. The Seljuk Empire, a Turco-Persian dynasty, defeated the Ghaznavids. And what did they do immediately? They set up a Persian bureaucracy. They fully adopted Persian culture, administration, and language. This is why the Seljuks are considered cultural ancestors of modern Western Turks.
We also see other regional Turkic dynasties like the Eldeguzids.
The Eldeguzids, or Atabegs of Azerbaijan, were a powerful Turkic dynasty in northwestern Persia. They were theoretically subordinate to the Seljuks, but operated independently for a long time.
Yet, through all this political upheaval, Arab, Bayid, Seljuk, the Persian language, emerged as the true victor.
It is the ultimate expression of cultural resilience. Persian became the lingua franca of high culture and poetry across the Islamic world. This is the era of epic poets whose legacies define the culture. Ferdowsi, who cemented the narrative of Persian identity in his monumental Shahnameh.
And of course, Saadi and Rumi.
Saadi, whose work served as guides on ethics, and Rumi, whose spiritual poetry remains globally read, and Hafez, whose poetry became so integrated into daily life.
The tradition of Fali Hafez?
Yes, the practice of seeking guidance from his verses. It shows that Persian poetry wasn't just entertainment. It was a source of moral and spiritual guidance, a shared cultural soul.
Unfortunately, this high point was brutally interrupted by the Mongol catastrophe.
The Mongol catastrophe, beginning with the invasion between 1219 and 1221, was arguably the most destructive military event in Iranian history.
And the scale of that devastation is just hard to comprehend.
The tactics were ruthless. The Mongols isolated and conquered major cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. Genghis and his son Tolui then laid waste to Khorasan. They destroyed Herat, Nishapur, and Merv, three of the largest, wealthiest cultural centers in the world. They wiped out the populations, a demographic shock from which the region would take centuries to recover.
After the initial destruction, Hulagu Khan established the Ilkhanate.
The Ilkhanate marked the consolidation of Mongol rule. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 was an irreparable cultural loss. But here's that persistence again. Even the Mongols were absorbed. Despite the military horror, Persian sophistication rapidly converted the invaders.
How quickly did that cultural absorption happen?
Quite quickly. The Ilkhanate, especially under rulers like Ghazan, who formally embraced Islam in 1295, saw a great impetus for Persian historical writing, often patronized by the Mongol rulers themselves.
And then the region was subjected to a second wave of Turco-Mongol conquest under Timur, or Tamerlane.
Timur, founder of the Timurid Empire, continued the cycle of conquest and destruction. He invaded Khorasan in 1381, and his actions were often characterized by extreme cruelty designed to inspire terror.
And during this time, we also have Turkoman groups dominating Western Iran.
The Akokunlu, or White Sheep Confederation. And like the Seljuks before them, despite their Turkoman background, Persian remained the official court language. It emphasizes again that political power might change hands, but the cultural and administrative framework remained resolutely Persian.
That brings us directly to the Safavid dynasty, a truly pivotal era because they cemented a religious identity that separates Iran from nearly all of its immediate neighbors.
The Safavids permanently altered the religious landscape. When Ismail I captured Tabriz in 1501, he immediately established Twelver Shia Islam as the official state religion. And this was enforced with an astonishing degree of violence.
A forced conversion.
Yes. Ismail I ordered the conversion of the predominantly Sunni population, and sources detail thousands being killed in purges when they resisted.
That must have created a deep need for legitimacy and, well, a clerical structure in a suddenly Shia state.
Absolutely. The population was largely Sunni. So to solve this, Ismail I had to import expertise. He brought in Arab Shia clerics from Bahrain, Iraq, and Syria to preach the Shia faith and establish the necessary religious infrastructure.
Did that policy of conversion continue consistently?
Not entirely. Ismail's successor, Tahmasp, was dedicated to it, but his son, Ismail II, briefly attempted a reversal, favoring a kinder approach towards Sunnis. This was short-lived. The general path continued, and it was only under Mullah Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, a very influential court cleric in the late 17th century, that Shia Islam truly took hold and was fully adopted by the vast majority of the masses.
Moving into the 18th century, the Safavids collapsed, making way for the military genius who temporarily restored Persian might, Nader Shah.
Nader Shah is a fascinating figure, a military powerhouse. He's best known for ending the Afghan rule, which had caused widespread chaos. He completely decimated the last Afghan army at the Battle of Zargan.
But his own Shah, Tahmasp II, interfered disastrously.
He did. Tahmasp II tried to take personal command and quickly undid Nader's successes. Nader was furious. He returned, forced Tahmasp to abdicate in favor of his infant son, and then rectified the situation before eventually crowning himself Shah.
This factionalism leads us directly into the Qajar dynasty, a period defined by weakness, internal pressure, and the slow, difficult birth of modern politics.
The Qajar era was defined by its failure to modernize and its inability to resist European encroachment. Early signs of deep popular dissent emerged with the tobacco protests between 1890 and 1892.
Who protest against foreign monopolies.
Yes, and it marked the first successful nationwide mobilization against the government and a foreign power, driven largely by the authority of the Shi'a clergy.
And that mobilization paved the way for the Persian constitutional revolution.
The revolution from 1905 to 1911 was truly monumental. It resulted in the establishment of the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, and the fundamental laws of 1906. It was an attempt to establish modern governance and limit the Shah's absolute power.
And this is where we see that critical tension between secular governance and religious authority first codified in the modern state.
That tension is foundational. The new system formally declared Twelver Shi'ism as the state religion and, crucially, mandated a council of 5 high-ranking Shia clerics to ensure that all laws passed by the parliament complied with Islamic principles. This mechanism of clerical oversight was planted at the very birth of Iranian democracy.
But the constitution faced violent opposition from the monarchy.
Muhammad Ali Shah Qajar violently opposed it, even using Russian Cossack forces to bombard the Majlis building. And while the constitutionalists eventually won, Iran's political weakness led to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which carved up the country into British and Russian zones of influence.
So the Qajars ultimately presided over a divided and isolated Persia, paving the way for a military strongman.
Exactly. The dynasty was eventually overthrown when Reza Shah, a colonel in the Persian Cossack Brigade, performed a coup d'etat in 1925, ending centuries of Qajar rule and founding the Pahlavi dynasty.
Reza Shah Pahlavi immediately set about a program of forced modernization, but his government was profoundly authoritarian.
It was a top-down, rapid modernization drive. He established an authoritarian government that prioritized nationalism, militarism, secularism, and anti-communism, all enforced by strict censorship. He reorganized the army, built massive infrastructure projects like the Trans-Iranian Railway, and modernized cities.
But his policy of neutrality couldn't survive World War II.
No. His reign ended abruptly in 1941, when he was forced to abdicate due to the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. The Allies occupied the country, using it as the crucial Persian corridor to supply the Soviet war effort.
Even after the war, the Allied forces didn't just leave, which led to the 1946 Iran crisis.
They had agreed to withdraw 6 months after hostilities ceased. But Stalin's Soviets remained in the north, actively supporting local Azerbaijani and Kurdish separatist forces. The Soviet withdrawal was eventually achieved only through tough negotiations and significant diplomatic pressure from the United States. And this event really hardened U.S. perceptions of Iran's geopolitical importance.
This post-war vulnerability set the stage for the pivotal confrontation over oil in the early 1950s, centered on Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
Mossadegh's nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company led to an immediate crisis with Britain. The British enforced a total blockade and took the matter to the UN.
Initially, the U.S. remained cautious, but the shift under President Eisenhower was dramatic, leading to the 1953 coup, Operation Ajax.
The U.S. attitude changed fundamentally. The Dulles brothers, the Secretary of State, and the CIA director feared Mossadegh's nationalist policies would lead to a second China. Operation Ajax was conceived and executed by the CIA with the Shah's explicit concurrence, moving to depose the only democratic government Iran had ever known.
What was the political pretext used to execute the coup?
The pretext was Mossadegh's decree dissolving parliament and accusations that he had granted himself dictatorial powers. The plan required the Shah to play his constitutional card, the right to dismiss a prime minister.
And how did the plot actually unfold?
The Shah signed firmans, or royal decrees, dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Zahedi as the new prime minister. Then, on August 15th, a colonel delivered the dismissal firman to Mossadegh.
But Mossadegh had been forewarned.
Yes, he rejected the firman and had the colonel arrested. Mossadegh later argued in his trial that while the Constitution technically allowed the Shah to do this in a constitutional monarchy, it was an abuse of power.
After that initial failure, the Shah fled the country.
He fled to Italy. But the subsequent CIA-backed mobilization with orchestrated riots and military units loyal to Zahedi ultimately succeeded. The mobs turned against Mossadegh, leading to his arrest and the Shah's triumphant return.
The 1953 coup solidified the Shah's absolute power and set the stage for this accelerated yet unbalanced development, which ironically bred the seeds of the 1979 revolution.
The oil boom of the 1970s financed major development, but it severely exacerbated unequal wealth distribution and social discontent. By 1976, leaders of the moderate National Front were already demanding compliance with the old 1906 constitution.
The intellectual dissent started to surface dramatically.
In the fall of 1977, the famous Dashab, or 10 Nights poetry readings at the Goethe Institute in Tehran, drew massive crowds of students and intellectuals, openly demanding an end to censorship.
And that momentum accelerated relentlessly in 1978, driven by the traditional cycle of mourning.
Yes. In January, an article insulting Ayatollah Khomeini triggered protests in Qom. When security forces killed demonstrators, the traditional 40-day mourning cycle created this self-sustaining rhythm of occurring protests across the entire country.
The violence then peaked on Black Friday.
In September 1978, a massive demonstration in Tehran's Jalous Square was met with extreme force. Government forces fired on unarmed crowds, killing hundreds. This event radicalized the population. By late 1978, the state was paralyzed. Oil workers went on strike, crippling the economy. The military began to disintegrate.
And the Shah's rule was over.
Yes. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi left Iran, never to return.
With the monarchy gone, Ayatollah Khomeini returned on February 1, 1979, greeted by millions. The transition was incredibly swift.
The establishment of the Islamic Republic was formalized very quickly. A referendum was held in March, asking whether to replace the monarchy with an Islamic Republic. The term wasn't really defined, but the result was announced as an overwhelming 98.2% in favor.
But the institutions that sprang up immediately were sources of a lot of controversy and conflict.
They were. Autonomous comitia, or revolutionary committees, acted as the eyes and ears of the new government, often dispensing revolutionary justice. Critics immediately documented their arbitrary arrests, executions, and confiscations. At the same time, the Hezbollah strong-armed thugs attacked demonstrators and journalists critical of Khomeini.
The new constitution then solidified Khomeini's ultimate power through the concept of clerical rule.
Yes, the constitution adopted in December 1979 established Khomeini as supreme leader, using a modified form of Wilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
This was Khomeini's own political theory.
It was. The version adopted was Wilayat al-Mutlaka, or absolute rule. This meant the ruling jurist had the religious mandate to suspend or even revoke divine ordinances if the interests of the state required it. This gave the supreme leader ultimate authority above the elected president and parliament.
That supreme leader, currently Ali Khamenei, controls the entire political architecture.
He's the head of state. He controls the armed forces, the judiciary, state television, and key oversight bodies. The most critical of these is the Guardian Council.
And this embodies that clerical oversight that was first planted way back in 1907.
Exactly. It has 12 members, 6 Islamic jurists chosen directly by the leader, and 6 jurists elected by parliament from a list of nominees provided by the Chief Justice, who is also appointed by the leader.
This gives the Guardian Council immense and decisive power.
Immense. They can veto any legislation passed by parliament, and most significantly, they hold the power to approve or disqualify all electoral candidates, ensuring only candidates adhering to the ruling ideology can compete.
The new regime immediately began eliminating its political opponents through the purges of the early 1980s.
Between 1981 and 1982, the regime targeted any perceived non-Islamic elements, communists, socialists, monarchists, and especially members of the Baha'i faith. The Rastiad Collective has verified the execution of over 3,400 political dissidents during this period.
And the UN recently highlighted the severity of these atrocities.
A July 2024 UN report categorized those atrocities as genocide and crimes against humanity, specifically noting that most victims were young activists.
Immediately after the revolution, Iran was plunged into 2 major foreign crises.
The Iran hostage crisis began on November 4, 1979. Students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding 52 staff hostage for 444 days. This shattered relations with the U.S.
And then the long, brutal Iran-Iraq War began in September 1980.
Saddam Hussein's Iraq initiated the invasion. His primary rationale was to prevent Khomeini from exporting revolutionary ideology and to replace Iran as the power broker in the Persian Gulf.
The early Iranian resistance was highly fragmented.
Initially, yes, but the Iranian Navy achieved critical early success, striking Basra and crippling Iraq's oil export capability. Ground forces generally fell back to the cities and set up intense defenses.
The war dragged on for 8 agonizing years, what finally brought it to a close.
The end came in 1988 when Iraq launched the Tawakkul Nala Allah operations, utilizing massive artillery and widespread chemical weapons. They broke through Iranian lines, effectively destroying Iran's military machine. Faced with imminent defeat, Khomeini reluctantly accepted a UN ceasefire.
Beyond the major war, Iran has also dealt with ongoing internal ethnic conflicts, notably with its Kurdish population.
Yes, following a 1994 agreement with Turkey, Iran launched a harsh crackdown on Kurdish populations and targeted dissidents abroad, which involved demolishing villages and assassinating opposition figures in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Moving into the 21st century, internal dissent returned powerfully, often triggered by economic grievances.
The 2017-2018 protests spread across the country over corruption and rising prices, with chants of death to dictator. The protests intensified dramatically in 2019-2020, triggered by massive fuel price hikes, and were met with extreme violence from security forces.
And there was that shocking controversy surrounding state media comments during those protests.
It highlighted the severity of the official response. A state television expert publicly called for detained protesters to be tortured to death, which illustrates the regime's zero-tolerance policy towards internal opposition.
Concurrently, Iran has been a centerpiece of global diplomacy due to its nuclear program, leading to the JCPOA.
The JCPOA of 2015 was a landmark deal. Iran agreed to severely restrict its nuclear program in exchange for relief from sanctions. It essentially traded immediate nuclear capability for economic access.
But the agreement soon began to unravel.
In 2018, the U.S., under President Trump, unilaterally withdrew and reimposed crippling sanctions. This drew condemnation from the remaining signatories, but it effectively crippled Iran's ability to benefit economically.
In terms of recent leadership, the death of President Ibrahim Raisi marked a shift.
Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash in May 2024, was a prominent hardliner. He enforced strict dress codes for women, called homosexuality savagery, and publicly questioned the Holocaust. His death necessitated a swift leadership selection process.
And finally, the history of conflict culminates in the recent dangerous escalation between Iran and Israel in 2024.
This conflict saw direct, unprecedented Iranian strikes on Israeli territory, followed by an Israeli retaliation. Israel attacked targets near Isfahan, crucially including a radar site associated with the Natanz nuclear facility. The U.S. and EU responded by tightening sanctions amid urgent international calls for de-escalation, highlighting Iran's current position at the nexus of major global conflict.
What an incredible, exhaustive journey. We have traveled from the earliest civilizations like Jiroft through the monumental Achaemenid and Sassanian empires, navigated the Islamic conquest and the Mongol catastrophe, and traced the trajectory right up to the complex conflicts of the modern Islamic Republic.
The key recurring pattern, I think, across these 6 millennia is the sheer overwhelming persistence of Iranian identity. Political systems, whether Greek, Arab, or Mongol, were repeatedly destroyed and replaced. But the enduring strength of Persian culture, its language, its art, its administrative ideals, it consistently absorbed the invaders.
This cultural bedrock ensures continuity.
Even as the political facade violently shifts, it is truly a testament to a civilization that, despite everything, refuses to be erased.
And if we look back over this entire history, there is one constitutional concept that really bridges the gap between the birth of modern governance and today.
Right. The Persian constitutional revolution of 1905 introduced the idea, codified in 1907, that laws passed by the democratically elected parliament must be subject to the approval of a council of high-ranking religious scholars.
And that concept, established over a century ago, is not just some historical trivia.
No, it is the defining feature of the current state. The Guardian Council, with its power to veto legislation and disqualify political candidates, is the direct descendant of that original 1907 mandate. So, despite millennia of conquest and revolution, what does it tell us about the foundational, unresolved tension in Iranian politics? The inescapable, relentless struggle between modern democratic mechanisms and entrenched supreme religious authority.
That question remains the engine driving Iran's future.